Hi, we complete 1 Samuel 22 today with the horrific scene of the mass slaughter of 85 priests by one man, Doeg the Edomite. And one of the amazing things to me in doing recent research and working through these chapters in preparation for doing these videos is for all the extensive attention to detail that so many scholars provide for these chapters, including, of course, Fackelman, who has 4 volumes, each roughly 1,000 pages on the 2 books of Samuel. I've not seen anybody who comments on the astoundingly unlikely possibility that one man single-handedly slaughtered 85 priests, and they neither ran away nor fought back nor protested in any way. And so we're going to comment that's this horrific story as if a one-man Central American death squad was at loose, asking some questions about what the narrator and the writers are telling us in this seemingly impossible scene. It certainly is telling us a lot about the character of Saul as the authors want us to understand it. So you can see on the right side of the screen, we've been following these interlocking chiasms, and last time we completed the end of this one because we're starting today on verse 17. But we can see in the chiasm that Falkelman has of this entire section, today we'll be looking at these sections where Saul orders the murder, parallel to the summoning of Ahimelech we looked at last time, Doeg's execution, and then David and Abiathar at the end, pulling these together, matching Saul at the beginning. So we'd last seen the king saying to Ahimelech, who stood there bravely and boldly and simply testified to the truth that David was as loyal a person to Saul as anybody, the king's response is, "You shall die, Ahimelech, you shall die, you and your father's house." And so with that shocking execution order, it says the king said to the guard who stood around him, which you immediately need to look at here, because we saw earlier he was surrounded by what the new RSV describes as servants, but I was noting the Hebrew makes clear are slaves, highlighting the embonded nature of these people to the king. These are not like employees, they're people who owe their lives to the king in whatever context we might know. We don't know much about slavery in this context, but that's how they're described. So we need to look literally, and you can see down below the Leretzim Hanatzavim here, literally those running the standing. That's an idiom here to highlight that those are the ones who were running for him but standing around him, as we saw, not called slaves here. And so those are the ones who he's calling on to execute Doeg, as we hear, turn and kill the priests of the Lord. And as you can see in the keywords thing, which I modified since it was last up, so I'll post the modified version on the webpage, the word turned is also in here 4 times, as you can see. Turn, turn, turn. Not the bird song from Ecclesiastes, but the verb in the Hebrew here to turn 4 times. And it simply means to turn, sab here, but highlighting the personal nature of the attack that's called for. When they generally go out to a war to attack the Philistines, they don't need to face the Philistines directly, and perhaps the enemy is in armor or has shields, and it can be rendered at least a little bit impersonal. Not quite as impersonal as guns did, and certainly not as impersonal as drones do nowadays. This is direct personal warfare. And so turn, and you have to look at them, although that's not stated, and kill the priest of the Lord, or of Yahweh, because their hand is with David. And it's just a horrific scene. The idea of a king of Israel, or in this case, the king of whatever people, he's referring to his people simply the Benjaminites, ordering his people, the royal entourage, to kill the priests of Yahweh. It's hard to imagine anything that would turn the audience more against Saul than that. And certainly we can't know about any historical Saul behind these stories, but certainly he's gone from being perhaps a sympathetic, paranoid person who lost the Spirit of God, and maybe we just feel bad for him, to someone from whom all the sympathy must have drained out at this horrific order here. Because these priests had done nothing. As far as we know, only Ahimelech has served David, and the others are simply there. We can presume they support Ahimelech, but they've not said or done anything. And yet they're all called to be slaughtered as one. And the answer, the reason is because their hand is with David. They knew that he fled and did not disclose it to me. And as we saw earlier, the phrase "did not disclose" is literally did not put it in my ear, reveal it to my ear. And the ear is repeated twice here to highlight that they didn't tell him. But as we saw, Saul's really not paying attention, because although these priests might have spoken to him, he also said that all his own slaves were conspiring against him and didn't disclose. And yet when he knew where David was, somebody told him that, and he sent sent somebody to get the priests, and they obeyed him. So we don't really know what the priests might have known and why they would or wouldn't have disclosed, and why would they need to tell the king about someone who's loyal, who's traveling around. The only reason they need to do that is because Saul the king is unjustly trying to kill David. And why should they report that? But Saul is not dealing rationally here, and that's the reason. So you're either on my side or you die, and we know how that can work in politics these days too, where loyalty is simply about personal loyalty rather than loyalty to the nation or to a way of point of view that you're trying to establish. This is not a world of you're violated the Torah or you're unfaithful to Yahweh. You simply were not with me, the king Saul. But the servants, and now they're referred to as the slaves again. And notice that this is the parallel, my note below says parallel to the midwives in Exodus, who Pharaoh told to kill the baby boys, and they refused to do it, although they didn't refuse to do it out loud. They did it quietly by coming up with the cover story that we hear in Exodus 1, and then working with Moses' mother and his sister by the river to take the baby Moses out of the ark and bring him into the royal Egyptian household. But here, this is done in public. And these servants are risking their own lives, just like Ahimelech was. But if Saul kills his own slaves, who does he have? So he doesn't respond to the fact that they would not raise their hand to attack the priests of the Lord here. And literally, they were not willing. And attack here is also, what we'll see in the next verse, this turn and attack is the phrase. So his own slaves failing to do it, he turns to Doeg, who gave him the report, you, Doeg, turn and attack the priests. Not named here as the priests of Yahweh, but obviously we know what they mean. And without any hesitation, he does it. And the text is so flat about something that is anything but flat. Doeg the Edomite turned and attacked the priest. On that day, he killed 85 who wore the linen ephod. And this image from Tissot's Bible here from 1899 gives you some brief sense of it, but I really want to pause here and consider a couple of possibilities. First of all, as I was hinting last time with Ahimelech's defense, that he has stood there knowing that this was likely to be the outcome, but he was willing to die rather than to betray David. But we don't know anything about the rest of these priests. They never speak, and they just stand there. So I think the only reasonable inference from this is that they're choosing to act with what we might call nonviolent civil disobedience, or at least willing to stand there and act as martyrs. They could run away. Even now, it doesn't seem like the servants of Saul, slaves of Saul, are going to chase them down. They weren't willing to kill them. They didn't have to come to Gibeah at all. They could have run away when they were in Nob. But getting the message from Ahimelech and the time they had to move from Nob back to where the king is in Gibeah, they must have collectively made the decision that we're going to die for the cause. And although the text I'll show you here from 2 Maccabees is from centuries later, we know there's a tradition for this that both in the Bible and in the Jewish tradition outside that. Let's just look at this one piece of the tradition from 2 Maccabees about the mother with 7 sons that were willing to die at the hands of the Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes rather than betray the Torah. So this is one of the mother speaking to one of the children here. I beseech you, my child, to look at the heaven and earth and see everything that is in them, and recognize that God did not make them out of things that existed. Thus also mankind comes into being. Do not fear this butcher, but prove worthy of your brothers. Accept death, so that in God's mercy I may get you back again with your brothers. While she was still speaking, the young man said, What are you waiting for? I will not obey the king's command, but I obey the command of the law that was given to our fathers through Moses. And we see in the historian Josephus similar stories, not reported directly in a scriptural text, of many Jews who were willing to put their necks on the line, literally to lie down and expose their necks to be cut, rather than allow the Romans to bring a Roman symbol into the Jerusalem temple. And in the book of Daniel, of course, we hear a number of stories, whether that's refusing to eat the king's rations or the fiery furnace, etc., where people are willing to suffer and die rather than betray the Torah. So although texts like Maccabees and Daniel are certainly centuries after the story that we're hearing here of the priests of Nob, it's certainly not something that was invented later, the idea that you could choose to die for the cause rather than to become like your enemy and attack back. And so we have what I would suggest the earliest example of nonviolent martyrdom in the Bible, of these priests of Nob willing to die. And And at the same time, let's consider from Doeg's perspective. The Romans would write about the fact that they had to change executioners sometimes during mass executions because it was so much physical labor to kill somebody that after a while, the executioners just ran out of strength. And to try to picture, as you can see from the Tissot painting, one man hacking away at what we find out in verse 18 or 85 priests just seems unimaginable. How long would we imagine that taking? I asked one person and she said days, and maybe it would be days or at least hours, at least a long time to make sure they were all dead. And we don't hear what kind of tool he has. We don't hear if he has a sword there, although in the next verse he says he put the city to the sword, so we can assume he has a sword here, but still one sword and 85 people. The amount of slaughter involved is just horrific. And what is Saul doing while all those priests are being killed? What are the slaves of Saul doing while all those priests are being killed? We hear nothing at all about any of that, but I want to at least slow it down so you as listeners of this story can at least pause to consider the stack of bodies and body parts that would have been left at the end of this. And as if that wasn't enough, then we hear this horrific afterword here. Nob, the city of the priests, and that's the first time we hear that Nob is designated a city of the priests, and this seems like a title of it as much as anything else, both in the Hebrew and the English. He put to the sword. Well, who's left? Well, men and women, children and infants, oxen, donkeys, and sheep, he put to the sword. What other men are left? If all the priests had come, we don't know. But this passage certainly reminds us with the children and infants of the command to Saul back in 15:3 with this exact same language. Let's go back and look at that for a moment. This is Samuel speaking on behalf of Yahweh here, and we go back in the previous verse, we see, thus says Yahweh of hosts, I will punish the Amalekites for what they did in opposing the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all they have. Do not spare them, man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So we see it's almost verbatim there. The oxen, donkeys, and sheep is the only slight difference. But it's recalling, of course, that as we know, two differences here. One is Samuel the prophet is claiming that this is Yahweh's command to do that, to kill these foreigners as punishment for their previous refusal of hospitality to the Israelites when they were leaving the Exodus. And whatever we might think of the idea of Yahweh carrying out divine punishment through human beings, something that's certainly not the case in the story of Jesus, but this is what I call the religion of empire text in the Hebrew Bible, not the religion of creation parts like Genesis or Exodus itself, where the punishment is directly from God and not given in the hands of people to carry out God's execution commands. Here, there's not only no sense that this is from God, but it's against the priests of Yahweh. And so it's almost the exact opposite of what Saul as king had been commanded to do, to protect the Israelites from the outside enemies, or to be Yahweh's instrument of vengeance against people who had been enemies in the past, but now to kill the very people who are supposed to be the mediators between Yahweh and the people. And well, of course, with great irony, he refused to kill King Agag and of the Amalekites, and that's what led Samuel to say, you violated Yahweh's order and that the kingdom would be taken away. But Nob, a city of priests, has no king, and as far as we can tell, the entire city is destroyed. No sheep taken for booty, as the sheep were taken for booty in Saul's case back in chapter 15. And despite of all that, somehow impossibly, like somebody escaping a Central American death squad in a city massacre as happened in the 1980s under U.S. sponsorship, one of the sons of Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. Now, several things we need to pay attention to. How does Abiathar know where David is, hiding in the forest of Horeth? How would he know that? If we're looking back at the atlas here, we saw Nob here and Gibeah here, and the forest of Hereth is here on the map, but we don't know really where it is. And how would Abiathar have even known he was there unless his father told him, and that may well be the way. But he escapes and fled after David. And Abiathar will be an important character. We'll see him mentioned in the next chapter as well. But let's jump to chapter 30 near the end here, and we'll see David said to the priest Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquires of the Lord. In other words, Abiathar does for David in chapter 30 what the question was whether Ahimelech did for David back here in chapter 22. And Abiathar, along with Zadok, who's also a relative of his, will be David's royal priests. And we'll see Abiathar all the way through, which highlights the fact that if interpreters think that Ahimelech and these priests died because of the curse on the house of Eli that we heard back in 1 Samuel 3, well, why not Abiathar too? because he will live out this whole reign of David through this. So Abiathar escapes, and now we have the parallel and the chiasm to Saul's report at the beginning, to 3 lines of report from the narrator, and 7 lines of speech from David here in our end of our chapter. So Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priest of the Lord. Notice he doesn't say that Doeg did it. He attributes it directly to Saul because, of course, Doeg was carrying out Saul's command, and it really Saul is the one responsible. And then we hear from David, and as Falkeman notes, 3 lines about the past, then 4 lines about today and the future. The first deals with death, and the second with life. So David said to Abiathar, I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul. And now that we know that officially in the text, we can go back and reinforce the interpretation I had of the scene between David and Ahimelech back in the beginning in chapter 21, when Ahimelech was trembling and they had their little coded discussion about holy bread and the sword of Goliath, to highlight that it was because of Doeg's presence that David knew that he had to speak to Ahimelech in coded language, because Doeg would surely tell Saul. And as it was, Doeg told Saul just enough to seal Ahimelech's fate and the rest of the priests. So in the New RSV it says, I'm responsible for the lives of all your father's house, but literally I have turned, and that highlights the turning element here. I've turned the lives of all your father's house. In other words, Doeg was told to turn and kill the priests, and David claims the responsibility for the one who turned their lives toward death, all the lives of your father's house. So he calls them to stay with me, or literally settle with me, which one of the points I made earlier is that the priests could have done that in the first place. They could have saved their lives. Ahimelech alone, or all the priests, could have gone off with David and been safe, but they chose to stand there and witness to the point of death instead. But Abiathar, saving his life, will go on to be David's royal priest, one of his royal priests, when he comes into the throne. So it finishes with, stay with me and do not be afraid, for the one who seeks my life seeks yours, and you will be safe with me. Literally, you can stand in custody with me. In other words, we will be amongst the same group, and our lives will go together. Whether we die together or we live together, this is where it will be. So it's not a matter of guaranteeing safety, but at least there'll be the relative safety in numbers, and neither of them will be alone. And of course, David already has his 400 bands of the marginalized to go with him. And so now, as you can see already, they told David the Philistines are fighting, and so we'll move on to the next scene here as we move into chapter 23, and David attacks Philistines in Keilah, but Saul is not far behind. And we'll get to that story in our next video next time. See you then. Bye-bye.